Last week, someone told us that we didn't need to wear seatbelts on a plane despite things like this happening. He's probably tired of me roasting him, but, well, good sir, you can't just spread all kinds of bad misinformation that endangers the public and get away with it. The roast continues. Coming up. Hey 7-4 crew, welcome back. If you don't know me, my name's Kelsey. I'm a 747 pilot. My channel, 7-4 Gear, is all about aviation. Now last week I talked about a guy spreading a bunch of misinformation about aviation that was not true. The video ended up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, so I had to make a part 2 to that video. Now I'm not going to blame Gary V, but Gary V, who has a lot of really good information that he puts out, I saw this video and I thought, maybe he has something to do with it.
Many people think they need to be an expert instead of just sharing your opinions and your thoughts. People get imposter syndrome because they think that people on video need to be experts. I remind people that the content that they put out should be predicated on the stuff that you would say at a dinner table with some new acquaintances or friends. It doesn't have to come from a place of authority, and I think that helps people feel more comfortable in sharing.
The reality is that your opinion does matter, even if you aren't an expert, let's say in fashion, and you want to give your opinion on what's cool and what's trending and what's happening, great, that's totally fine. If you're giving information about something that you know nothing about, that's endangering other people, that's not cool. If you're giving medical advice, like if I gave you medical advice of what to do in this emergency situation, I don't know anything about medicine, so you could end up killing someone. Just like this guy who knows nothing about aviation is giving aviation advice, just like the TikTokers that I roast and all these people. Stop giving false information. If you don't know something about a subject, it's okay not to know something about it. Go learn something about it. But if you know nothing about it, stop making videos like you're an expert on it. So that's the only time where I'm really disagreeing with what Gary V is saying. Yes, it's okay to have an opinion and you don't need to be an expert on certain topics, but giving advice to people or giving information that's false to people, that is not acceptable to me. All right, let's see what this guy has to say.
Think of an airplane as a giant bus with wings. You wouldn't really need to wear a seatbelt on a bus, and you most likely don't really need one on a plane either. In the event of an airplane crash, a seatbelt probably isn't going to save your life. It will, however, keep you strapped in while the flight attendant hands out beverages and peanuts. Even though the plane is landing, you could probably end up just fine if you're hanging on to something instead. This has led companies like Ryanair to consider flights where people are actually standing the entire time for a cheaper price.
You are more than welcome to not wear your seatbelt, but I fly more than most of you, and I wear my seatbelt when I go up to the flight deck. The only time I'm not wearing my seatbelt is obviously when I'm getting up to, well, find snacks or go to the bathroom or, check on different things that I'm doing while I'm on a flight. But while I'm up there, while I'm seated, while I'm in my seat, I wear my seatbelt. There's no reason not to, because things like this happen. Now, I've talked about before that generally I can tell when the turbulence is coming, but there's times where it happens and you don't notice, you don't feel that it's coming, and then you don't want to have a situation where you're now injured because we're flying over the middle of the ocean, you're not wearing your seatbelt, you get thrown up, you hurt yourself, you break your neck, or something bad happens, you have a concussion, and now we have to get one of the doctors on the plane to attend you, and now the whole plane of 400 something people has to divert and go somewhere because you were too cool to not wear your seatbelt. Look, I get it, it's maybe not that comfortable, but you can release these things and relax them so they're really not even noticeable. As a pilot, imagine this situation. Imagine I go to the flight deck and me and the captain, neither of us are wearing our seatbelts. We're just sitting up there talking and enjoying ourselves, and then we hit some unexpected turbulence. Both of us get thrown into the ceiling of the plane, and now our heads are hurt or are partially unconscious or have something in our eye because we were looking up. Who knows what the situation is? You would think that's very irresponsible. Well, it's the same way that I feel about you as a passenger. By not wearing your seatbelt, not listening to your flight attendants, or if we put the seatbelt sign on, by you not wearing your seatbelt, you are endangering yourself, which, that's your prerogative. But now you could be creating a huge inconvenience for the entire flight crew and all the people on board because you felt too cool to put your seatbelt on. Just something to keep in mind. And despite what the people of TikTok tell you, and some of those people from YouTube who don't know anything about aviation, your seatbelt is there for your safety. You should be wearing it, and your flight attendants are not just there to serve you pretzels and give you Cokes, despite the jokes that pilots will make with them sometimes. They're really there for the evacuation of the plane during an emergency. There's been numerous cases of flight attendants actually saving the lives of hundreds of people because the pilots were incapacitated and a flight attendant made that decision to evacuate. which is not an easy decision to make, because they have to, if they make the decision and it's a wrong decision and people die, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. So for a flight attendant to make that decision to evacuate people and save bunches of lives, hundreds of lives in some cases, it's really, that seems to go unnoticed. When a pilot does it, it's great. When a flight attendant does it, sometimes people just disregard it. The flight attendants are there, and they're all based on the number of seats that are available on that aircraft. So they're there to make sure that their zone of responsibility, their section, is safely evacuated. So just something to be aware of.
Number 4, pilots get a special meal. Do you think the pilot is going to eat the same thing as the guy sitting all the way back in the coach section? Think again. The pilot doesn't want to take any risk with getting sick from food poisoning or other factors associated with airline food. This will lead them to have a meal that's pre-made. You wouldn't want the pilots to get sick and not be able to land the plane, but the rest of us get sick, whatever.
So in your mind, Mr. YouTube guy, you think that there are two totally separate catering companies, one that's bringing the food for us pilots, and then the whole other set of catering company that's bringing the food for the other 300-400 people on the plane. That's what you think is going on when you say this?
Do you think the pilot is going to eat the same thing as the guy sitting all the way back in the coach section? Think again.
So it is true that both pilots will eat separate meals. That is a thing. And the reason being is that if they ate something, let's say that fish had gone bad and you both ate fish, then there would be a problem. So we eat separate meals. That part is true. As far as for us eating separate catering different from the catering that's going on in the back of the plane, well, that's not true. Typically, this has been my experience when I've done passenger flying at an airline that most of you know in the US, the food that gets catered to the first class, any leftover meals, those will get brought up to the pilots, depending on the length of the flight. Sometimes you'll have food that's set there for you. Sometimes it's just what's left over because they'll over cater the first class. So if you're a good pilot, you'll make sure that your flight attendants don't want anything to eat from that food. And if they don't, then you take what's left over. If you're not a good pilot, then you'll just take all the food. Anyway, that is typically the food that the pilots are going to eat, is the leftover food from first class. On shorter flights, on longer flights, they'll have food set aside and catered for the pilots. But it's not like we want all the passengers to get sick. If you have some massive sickness that goes on while you're in flight and now you're throwing up uncontrollably on the floor, well then now we, as an airline, are going to have to divert somewhere so you can get medical attention, which is going to cost the airline lots of money. You got to realize when you go land somewhere, you have to go get gas, maintenance, fuel, all those things cost a lot of money. The airlines pay a lot of money for the food that goes on that plane. So they're not going to have a catering company that's out giving you bad food. And so if something like this happens, it's not just a whatever, it's a problem, because now we as pilots have to deal with the fact that you're sick, throwing up on the floor, or we have to get a doctor to help figure out what's going on, and we're not going to want to do that, and the airline doesn't want to have that press. So it's not just a whatever. That's not true at all. Now, full disclosure, have I ever eaten something on a plane where I got sick or it didn't feel well? Yes, it has happened. And the reality is if you've eaten out at restaurants for years and years and years, you're sooner or later going to go to a restaurant where you're not going to feel well. So that presents a question. What happens if the pilots eat something and they both get sick for whatever reason? Let's say the salad was bad. Well, on most commercial airliners, including the one that I fly, if there's a situation where I felt so sick I was throwing up and the other pilot was throwing up and we couldn't really fly the plane very well, we could still push enough buttons to get the plane safely on the ground. You would be sweating and throwing up and not feeling well, but you could safely get the plane on the ground because most commercial airliners have an auto landing system. So you'd be able to get the plane on the ground. And then there would be a huge investigation to the people who catered that food. They would have a lot of problems and probably would lose that customer, which would cost them millions of dollars. So they're not going to want to have that problem. But in the hypothetical scenario, both the pilots ate the fish, like on the movie Airplane. If that were to happen to me, could I safely get the plane on the ground? Absolutely. And then I would ask for a few days off.
Number 3, down plane problems. Pilots don't like to admit that there's a huge problem going on and will calmly try to downplay the issue in order to make people feel at ease. There are a lot of things that can happen to the plane or could cause the flight to go less smoothly than desired. Sometimes while flying, pilots might encounter zero visibility. If they do mention anything at all, they might say something like, "Oh, it's just a little bit of fog, no big deal." If your flight is delayed for hours because the engine is falling off, they might just say, "Oh, it's only some technical issues."
I honestly don't even know where to begin with what he's saying, but let's start with the fog.
If they do mention anything at all, they might say something like, oh, it's just a little bit of fog, no big deal.
So just like I just talked about, there really is no problem on a lot of aircraft with fog or visibility because a plane can do an auto landing and land at that given airport with minimal visibility. There's some that are required, but minimal visibility. So it's really not a big deal, A. B, you as a passenger can't really do anything with that information. Hey, the airport's fogged in. Well, what are you as a passenger going to do with that information? You're not going to fly the plane or pick a location of where to go next, so we're not going to pass that information along to you. We'll let you know, hey, we can't land because the weather at the airport is not available for landing or whatever the situation may be, but we also have backup airports that we can go to. So we're checking all the different other airports that we can go to, and that's why planes fly with a bunch of extra fuel, so they can safely go to another airport if the one that they were intending to go to, for whatever reason, a plane were to crash on that runway and close that only runway, well then you're going to need gas to go to another airport. So planes have and airlines give us extra gas so we can safely go to another airport. And so that's why you might think pilots are doing this.
Pilots don't like to admit that there's a huge problem going on and will calmly try to downplay the issue in order to make people feel at ease.
There's so much preparation that goes into flights, and there's so many people behind the scenes. There's people called dispatchers that are always watching your flight. Any flight that you're on has a dispatcher. That dispatcher is watching that flight and tracking that flight. And there are people, for example, General Electric, who makes the engines on most of the planes that I fly. There are people there that are looking at the engines all the time to make sure that everything looks good. There are so many people behind the scenes that you don't even ever see or know that are there involved in helping your flight safely get to its destination. So there's very rarely going to be a situation where the pilot's up there freaking out like, oh my gosh, now what? Now what are we going to do? Because we have extra gas and we have a lot of people. We have a satellite phone. We can call and say like, hey, we need some help. This airport and this airport and this airport is closed. We need to go somewhere else. You have air traffic control who's also on the ground who can help find something to do. So there's so many things. The pilots aren't downplaying it. It's very rare that there's going to be a situation where the pilots are freaked out. So that's why it sounds like, oh, it's not a big deal. The airport's closed right now. We're not worried about it because there's so many other options and there's so many people that are there to help us. It's not that we're downplaying. It's just not a big deal. If your pilot ever makes an announcement where they sound freaked out, well, maybe then it's time to be nervous. But if they sound calm and cool, like, hey, it's not a big deal, then it's really not a big deal.
Number 2, packing some heat. You're certainly not allowed to carry a firearm in your carry-on bag if you go on a plane, but that doesn't mean that the pilot isn't. You might not ever see a person flying the plane, and it could be a Terminator robot for all we know. Pilots that carry firearms are known as Federal Flight Deck Officers, and they're specially trained to carry weapons on commercial aircraft in case of total chaos breaking out. In order to have this privilege, pilots must endure some serious background checks, marksman tests, physical fitness tests, and so on. In 2008, on a US Airways Flight 1536, a gun went off somehow while the pilot was trying to store it. Although it didn't hurt anyone, it left a big hole in the side of the cockpit.
I was actually thinking of not even using this clip, but I didn't want you to think that I was like trying to hold out in case you ever looked at the original video and keep some secrets from you. This program does exist, Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. That is a real thing. And this part right here.
In 2008, on a US Airways Flight 1536, a gun went off somehow while the pilot was trying to store it.
I actually met that guy that happened to. It's kind of a long story, but the short story version of it is that he was doing what he was supposed to do, properly trying to stow the gun. Somehow it went off, and there was a bunch of people with badges and suits as soon as they landed. And from what he told me, this is just his account of it, that nobody on the plane realized what had gone on. There's a lot of noise that are on there, so nobody, except the two guys that were flying, nobody else knew what was going on, but they reported it. So when they reported it, there was a ton of people there when they landed, but the passengers were unaware of it. And they were low enough to the ground that it wasn't even a depressurization issue. But that just goes to show you, gun went off on the flight deck, through the whole of the plane, all the way out, right? And nothing crazy happened, and a huge amount of papers didn't go flying anywhere, as far as I know.
And number 1, flat Earth. If anyone out there knows for sure the exact shape of planet Earth, it would be pilots out there who fly around all the time. They see the surface of Earth from above on a common basis. Many people believe that pilots are holding back on the public and know that all we've learned in school is a complete lie. How could they hold out on us like that? Some videos online out there show flat earthers asking pilots if the Earth is round or flat. Some will even respond that the Earth is flat. Whether they're doing that to avoid an argument or not is unclear, so be sure to ask your pilot next time and try to uncover the truth.
Really, I'm not doing more about flat Earth, but let me just address this one thing right here.
They see the surface of Earth from above on a common basis.
Okay, Mr. YouTube guy, here's the thing to realize. We are up on the flight deck at the exact same altitude that you're at, sitting on the back as a passenger. So our view is literally the same view of the curvature of the Earth. Have I seen the light in a way that proves that the Earth is curved? Yes, I absolutely have. Have I talked about flat Earth a bunch in several different videos like this one here? Yes, I have. Am I talking more about it? No, I'm not. If you want to see another video that you might find entertaining, check out this video up here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.